everyone. Welcome to Flight Training Advice. We wish to provide you with an online resource that will clarify issues related to basic flight training and general aviation operations in the Philippines. In this presentation, we'll talk about a commonly misunderstood subject among many pilots learning to fly in the country: airspace. We'll talk about the different classes of airspace, how the construction differs from other countries, and we'll also discuss general VFR and IFR principles when operating inside each class. How many of you were taught straight out of this book while in flight school? Despite its being an excellent reference for universally common aviation subjects such as aerodynamics, weather, and the like, when it comes to airspace, that is where this textbook's applicability ends for countries outside the US. While the different airspace classes A through G are common globally in terms of how traffic is separated based on ICAO definitions, the way it is laid out in different parts of the globe can translate into some differences in operating procedure. So let's take a look now at the ABCs of airspace in the Philippines, so to speak, and eventually we'll talk about what's expected of you as a pilot when operating within a specific class of airspace. So let's start with the most basic: Class G airspace. Class G is what's more commonly known as uncontrolled airspace. It makes up the majority of the country's airspace, and it practically surrounds all the other airspace classes in the Philippines. There is no controlling agency providing traffic separation for both IFR and VFR flights. See and avoid is the primary method for airborne collision avoidance in VMC, and therefore a 250 knot speed limit applies to all aircraft operating below 10,000 feet MSL. As for two-way radio communication requirements, typically there is none in Class G for VFR aircraft. However, if there is an established aerodrome advisory zone around an uncontrolled airport, VFR aircraft in the vicinity need to have two-way radio communication equipment on board. An Aerodrome Advisory Zone, or AAZ, may be established in uncontrolled airspace around an airport if a flight service station, or FSS, is located on the field. The boundary of the AAZ typically extends horizontally to a 5 nautical mile radius from the aerodrome reference point and vertically from the surface up to 2,000 feet AGL. Despite being Class G airspace, it is mandatory for pilots to maintain continuous listening watch over the FSS frequency as specified by the Visual Flight Rules Section 1.8 of the AIP. Any flight that is planned into an AAZ must therefore have communication equipment on board following Philippine Civil Air Regulations Part 7.3.1. IFR aircraft, on the other hand, are required to have two-way radio communication equipment in Class G and all the other classes of airspace at all times. Contact must be made with the nearest ATC facility or flight service station in order to obtain an IFR clearance in Class G. Once an IFR clearance has been obtained in Class G, responsibility for traffic separation solely rests with the pilot in command, given the lack of ATC jurisdiction and services. Only by maintaining constant communication with the nearest ATC or FSS to receive traffic information services can a pilot maintain traffic awareness and own separation in IMC while in Class G. Uncontrolled airports in the Philippines typically do not have published instrument procedures. Thus, if an aircraft flying IFR is inbound into an uncontrolled airport, the IFR flight plan must be cancelled by the pilot prior to leaving controlled airspace. It is therefore necessary that VMC conditions exist before the cancellation in order to revert back to the see and avoid method of own traffic separation. If it is not possible to continue the flight under VFR, ATC must be informed to stay within controlled airspace and remain IFR. A note about the FSS. While FSS personnel may sound like air traffic controllers over the radio, any form of advisory received from an FSS is purely for information. They are not a controlling agency. That's why flight service stations, distinguished by the term radio appended after the station call sign, can only issue advisories such as "you may take off" or "you may land," and not the more common "cleared for takeoff" or "cleared to land" instructions used by ATC. Ultimately, it means that the responsibility rests solely with the pilot on how to safely navigate through uncontrolled airspace. To wrap up, whenever you're in Class G airspace, think of G for gone because ATC will not be there to provide you with the services other than advisories. Whether you're flying VFR or IFR in Class G, the responsibility for traffic separation rests solely with you, the pilot.